So what sort of households are most affected? Well, as normal with these sorts of things, the wealthier people have much less affected by some of the problems that we have with the UK housing market. So the households which are disproportionately affected by the issues we have in the market are low-income families. They suffer the most. After that, the elderly, women, first-time buyers all suffer disproportionately. And then finally, ethnic minorities. And generally, if you're looking at anything in health, then usually it has a worse effect on ethnic minorities than it does on any other group. So what sort of effects might we be talking about? Well, for housing quality issues, things that are a concern are around poorly designed properties. So we still have a legacy of properties that were when they were originally constructed were not constructed with current building regulations in mind, and so this might be just the fact that they're old properties, such as Victorian period properties, properties constructed prior to around the 1930s, which have solid walls. And so these properties are very difficult to insulate. They're what's known as hard to treat properties. And where these properties are very difficult to insulate, it can cost anything up to around £13,000 to put on external wall cladding to insulate them, making the cost of these interventions quite prohibitive. There are much easier insulation options for properties built after this period, as you can always insulate the loft of a property, but if you've got cavity walls, you can insulate the cavity wall retrospectively. Interestingly enough, glazing most people consider makes a big difference to the level of warmth in a property, but actually cavity wall insulation and loft insulation are the big hitters for insulation improvements, and don't cost very much at all, whereas glazing costs many thousands of pounds to replace, and actually doesn't have as big an effect on the thermal efficiency of the property. Poorly designed may also include issues such as steep staircases in older properties, and if you're looking at properties that were built after the Second World War, so-called prefabricated dwellings, these may be properties which were constructed after the Second World War in factories. The problem being that during the Second World War, a lot of our skilled tradespeople from construction and building maintenance went to fight, and when they so many of them were killed, and so at the end of the war we had a distinct shortage of skilled tradespeople. We had an awful lot of houses that needed building because we'd suffered from a lot of bombing, and we had a legacy of older poor condition properties that needed replacing, particularly around so-called slum dwellings, in areas of poor quality housing, which we had our war heroes coming back to live in and caused an outcry at the time. After the First World War in particular, but also we had similar calls after the Second World War. But we also had a set of a manufacturing base and a labour force that was particularly good at making things out of both metal and concrete, and so they did large house building, so they did a lot of house building in factories, so-called prefabricated dwellings, which were built in sections and then taken via lorry to the site and craned into place, often within a few days on the site. These properties were only ever supposed to last for about 20 years, but many of them are still in use today and present some unique challenges for what were predominantly public sector housing, what were and are predominantly public sector housing providers, in order to try to bring them up to either the Welsh Housing Quality Standard or the Decent Homes Standard if they were in England. So it might be Dampness, that was a problem in these. It might be excess cold that's a problem in these properties. But all of these issues are going to have a knock-on effect on the health of the people that live there, as long as they remain design errors with those design issues with those houses. And so you still got to rectify these, and an awful lot of them by now are going to be owner-occupied dwellings through right to buy or similar processes, which have resulted in them being occupied by people who may not have the finances to be able to improve them to current modern day standards. Overcrowding has also become an issue, causing a range of problems such as stress, spread of infections, reduced educational attainment, as children in an overcrowded house aren't going to have access to a quiet study space. And it may be that these issues have to be dealt with through thinking about alternative methods of providing assistance to the people in the properties, not just taking punitive enforcement action against them or the property owners. And then considering the built environment, consider things like sort of wider issues around where people live. If you've got a high crime area, you've got to consider issues such as the fear of crime and social isolation, poor access to health facilities and other facilities in the area, area regeneration issues. And so this sort of thing will touch more upon in later teaching, but for the purposes of this e-lesson, we're considering improvements we can make in an area that's addressing some of the wider determinants of health. Finally, you need to consider how easily it is to adapt to property if the occupier has become disabled, as this affects a significant percentage of the UK population, and this is going to increase as our population gets older. And so we need to think about the adaptations we need to make to our residential properties to enable people to continue to live independently within them, and to reduce the reliance that they have on state-aided support.